real German lady, and she was born over there and married somebody and came back to America.
Yeah.
Sometime in, what did you say, 52?
1952.
1952.
I was a war bride.
And after that, you got the floor.
Well, this all happened before 1952, because as you know, the war really ended in 45. And what happened, actually the end of the war was, the beginning of the end, was at the siege of Stalingrad, where over 2 million people were killed, simply because Stalin and Hitler hated each other. Hitler was advised that it was not strategically wise to go and attack Stalingrad, but he hated Stalin so much and Stalin hated Hitler so much, so 2 million people had to die, which is probably puts in one thing how I feel about war. Anyway, that was pretty much it. The German troops had to withdraw, and the war went back and forth, you know, in Africa and everything. And in the meantime, where I lived, after living in almost every part of Germany, because my father was transferred in his own firm to different places, and my mother and I went with him. And but the thing is, we ended up in a place that's called like the middle of Germany, which is Saxony. And in Saxony, between Leipzig and Merseburg, there is a little town called Bad Dürrenberg, which was an old spa. But they decided to build the largest and most expensive chemical factory in all of Germany, and it was the most protected area by the Flak, which is the anti-aircraft. And during the war, I lived like 3 kilometers away from this work, and in a settlement where primarily people who worked for them lived. And at the end of the war, we just stayed in the basement because the air attacks were so rapid. You know, it was hard. I lived in an apartment building with 4 other families, and our next door neighbor upstairs had a little 1-year-old, no, not even 1-year-old baby, and a little one, and they had to carry the baby carriage up and down, you know, and it got to the point where we had alarm like 4 times a night. And then we decided, well, it's not worth it. You know, we at that point, we were sleeping in our clothes anyway. So they put up cots in the basement, and we slept there. And by that time, it was almost continuous bombardment. And as I didn't know how much we were bombed until I read this on the computer. And they dumped they had over 6,000 sorties on this particular industrial area. And they dumped 18,000 tons of bombs. And they said themselves, the pilot said, you know, half the time the air was so polluted and everything that they couldn't even see where they were dropping the bombs. Well, they were dropping them on us. And, well, anyway, we were in the basement about 2 weeks, and then all of a sudden a different noise was, because, you know, when the planes come, I don't know if you know, even if a plane has like 1 propeller, it makes a lot of noise. But these were 4-motor bombers, and they were like coming in 10s at a time. The noise, the roar was very scary. And then all of a sudden you hear tuck, 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 you know, and that's the anti-aircraft. And the sky is crossed with all these lights, I forget what they call them. Anyway,
Tracers.
yes. They were all over the place. And we just, our mothers would go upstairs every now and then and get some food down, and we'd eat, but we'd we just stayed in the basement. And all of a sudden, besides the flak and the bombers and the bombs, which shook everything, there was a different noise. And somebody said, that's artillery. So we didn't know who was shooting at us, but it was something different. And we were hoping it was the Americans, because we were very afraid of the Russians, because their reputation had preceded them, because there were all kinds of atrocity committed in the name of war, But we were very much afraid of the Russians, but we were afraid of everybody, So anyway, after 2 weeks of this whole thing, a man yelled down the cellar steps and said, "The Amis are here."
Amis?
They call them the Amis. And
Americans.
yeah,
Amis.
Amis are Americans. Did you know you were Amis? Well, anyway, we slowly went up the stairs, and looked out the front door and couldn't believe it was beautiful sunshine. It was a May Day, it was beautiful. And then we heard a plane coming over. We ran right back down in the basement. And because they had, the sirens had stopped a long time ago. Communications had stopped. Schools have stopped. No radio, no newspaper, no nothing. We didn't know what was going on. But the last papers that we got, they said, this one woman was raped 48 times in a row and all this kind of stuff. So it scared the heck out of us, But anyway, after a while we figured, well, the plane's not going to do anything anymore, So we sort of came up the next day and people said, they're in our schoolyard. So we kids slowly went over to the schoolyard, and here there were, the whole schoolyard was full of tanks and these things that looked like flower cases. They were green boxes. And we found out later that was munition. And we just looked at these people, and it was so strange because we had never seen helmets with nets on them and all these twigs in them and everything. It was really weird. And we just looked from far and walked all around and looked, So the next day we got a little bit closer. And some of the soldiers smiled at us, and they had these big cauldron things, and they were cooking there, and people went and got food. And there on the end of the field, there were two guys, and they had this crazy-looking leather mitt, and they were throwing the mitt back and forth. And we still could hear the artillery and everything because they had gone over us now, And we thought that was really weird, But after a while, they smiled at us, and we smiled back. And, well, to make a long story short, we were afraid, because we didn't know. You might have come from Mars. And here, they started giving out candy bars. And none of us had ever had candy bars before. And after that, we were not afraid anymore.
That'll do it.
So anyway, in the meantime, in the adult world, things had gone totally crazy because it was amnesty. All the stores and everything was broken into, and everything was plundered. And even the school, like the flak had taken over half of our school, and there was food there. And people came and they grabbed all the food and everything. And there was my mother and I. My father was in the service then, and my mother and I went to the school, and we were afraid to go in, you know, with all this stuff going on. But this man had a net, and he had all these cans of food in the net on his bicycle, and the net broke, and he threw himself on the food, you know, and we got 2 cans that ran through behind his legs. But it was a wild time, and at that time there was a curfew. We all had to be in the house by 5 o'clock, and nobody was allowed to go near the window or door or anything, because the streets were all being patrolled by the Americans, you know. So that went on for a while, and then all of a sudden, we heard these rumors, the Russians are supposed to come. Now, we didn't know that they had already planned how to divide Germany at the Yalta Conference and at the Potsdam Conference. Stalin and Churchill and Roosevelt, they all got together and decided how they were going to split us up, you know. But we didn't know that, and apparently the Russians insisted they wanted our part. So without song or anything, all of a sudden the Americans disappeared, and the Russians marched in. And, you know, it was really weird, because some of them were on these big trucks, and they were sitting on the side, and they had the beards, and they looked kind of Mongolic, but who knew at that time what they were. But all of a sudden the Russians were there, and we were afraid, and before we knew it, all these rumors were spreading around, you know, and everybody was scared to death. And we had to bring, I was still a school child then, we had to bring all our school books to our school, and they got rid of them somehow. And in the fall we got new school books, and we also got a new curriculum. In grammar school, all German kids had to learn, it was mandatory that you learned Russian. We could learn English if we wanted to. We had algebra, chemistry, and a lot of subjects that are being taught in high school here. And so it turned out I had 3 years of Russian. We were in school from 8 to 1. That's 5 hours, and 2 of the 5 hours we were usually indoctrinated in Russian, in reading, writing, and grammar. And English we could learn if we wanted to, but we had to come 3 mornings early to school, and for half hour early, and we were able to learn English then. That's the only English schooling I ever had. But as I told Simon, I haven't seen anybody from Russia since 1948, and it until I moved here 4 years ago, and here my building has like 20 Russians here, and they're wonderful people, you know, and I'm so frustrated because I've forgotten so much. But anyway, to make a long story short, under the Russians, what happened was really strange. My father was working, and they had, Leipzig was like an exhibition town. And there was an exhibition in Leipzig, and my father and his colleague went there. They had an exhibition at this, whatever it's called. And the first time they went, because you needed papers when you left town, you were not allowed to leave the town without any papers. So they had provided themselves with these papers, and they're driving along, and all of a sudden there are Russians standing in front of the street and stopped them. And my father and his colleague went out and they said, here, Papiere. And they said, scheiß Papiere. And they tore them out.
I know what that means.
Yeah, I figured that. But anyway, they made them stand all day and chop wood. My father and his colleague. His name was Mr. Ulrich. I still remember him. And then they came back, and the next day, Mr. Ulrich and his secretary went to Leipzig. And on the way home, there were again other Russians who wanted to stop them. And they said, heck, I don't feel like chopping wood again, you know. So he just went through. They shot him in the back. Oh. He was killed, and his secretary called my father, and it was up to him to tell his widow that her husband was dead. So those kind of things were not unusual at that time. And in the meantime, we were all pretty hungry. In school, we were getting vaccinated almost every week for something or another, typhoid or diphtheria or whatever. And we were all malnourished. You wouldn't believe it now. But we were all starving, and I don't know if it was because of the malnutrition or what, but we all broke out in these awful boils. On the hands, on the knees, on the waist, everywhere, you know, and they were very painful. And anyway, the Russians had taken everything they could, you know, like the coal and everything they transported to Russia. This is my $4.97 watch, and it keeps wanting to lose. Anyway, they took the railroads too, and near our settlement were people who mainly worked for this chemical company. They also were working on rockets, the V2, which is, well, I know one of the scientists ended up with Werner von Braun. And anyway, they had all the railroads taken out and shipped to Russia, but near our settlement they had to have another railroad so that two trains could pass each other. And as soon as one train stopped, we kids used to play on the embankment, somebody whistled, and we kids would jump on the coal trains, and we put coals in a bag and throw it down, and our parents would run it, bring it home, you know, and also fertilizer, because we were so hungry that if we bought like 5 pounds of fertilizer to a farmer, he'd give us maybe 5 or 10 potatoes. So, and it's pretty hard to walk with fertilizer on your back. But anyway, they also had one train that had all these funny bunches of wool, but they were covered with this glass sort of thing. So we took it, and in each backyard, people were stripping the glass off the wool, and we made things out of it. In fact, that sweater is made from that kind of wool. And then what happened one night, the doorbell rang in every apartment in my building, and my father was back by then, and he looked down and he said, there are Russians down there, and they're asking for Dr. Elm. And so Dr. Elm let them in, and next thing we hear is they have to pack up everything, their children, all their furniture. They could take their maid with them for 5 years in Russia. And at the same time that this happened to our neighbor, it happened in 34 households in the same settlement. It was a scientific community, and they took them all to Russia to pick their brains, you know. And after Dr. Elm was gone, a widow with 3 sons moved in. And the youngest one was only 5. And he was this skinny little kid, and he had these skinny legs, and his mother had knitted him shorts, and they were just fluttering in the wind, you know. But he was so cute, and we had a little Pomeranian dog, and I had piano lessons. So when I was playing piano, Shishi came over, and he danced with the Pomeranian. And he was, you know, my mother tried to help him because he was always hungry. He would come down, running down the road saying, Frau Meyer, they have rice on number so-and-so. And my mother fed him because, for one thing, she knew a doctor who prescribed cod liver oil. So she would make pancakes with cod liver oil. The whole thing smelled, but it tasted okay. Because what we had done is when the harvest was ripe, the farmers came and reaped it, and whatever was left, we'd go with these big pillowcases and pick everything, and then we'd beat the pillowcases with our carpet sweeper things, not the sweepers, beater things.
Yeah.
And then we would let the wind blow away the shafts, and then our mothers would mill it through the coffee mill. And that's how she made pancakes. And he kept saying, Frau Meyer, you're rich. And the funny thing is, when my father was back working, and when he came home, Shishi would run to him, you know, and my father would say, well, how was kindergarten? And he said, we had potato soup. He was always hungry. And one time, I think that must have been really cruel of my father, but he wasn't thinking. He came home and he said, what do you think we should do with Smaller? That was the Pomeranian. Do you want to keep playing with him? Or should we kill him and eat him? And this little 5-year-old who loved this dog stood there like this and he said, let's eat him. Very sad. But what happened after we escaped, we found out that the mother of these 3 boys had committed suicide. And my parents, already in the West, were trying to adopt Shishi, but it never worked out. Don't know what happened to him. Anyway, that was Shishi. So we were there, and after all these doctors and scientists and everybody had been brought to Russia, my father became very worried because he was not directly working for this thing, but he was a subcontractor. He was for an office that did subcontracts for them. And we were afraid one of these days they're going to ship us to Russia, you know. So in order to go to the West, because everything had been bombed out, you know, you needed to have a certificate that you have a place to live. And so they let me go first with my aunt and my cousin. We went and we get to Leipzig, and they say, this is the day that the mark is going to be, in other words, in the West, the mark is only going to be worth 10% of what it is now. And we're standing in Leipzig on the railroad station, and they said the trains stop within 25 kilometers of the border. Now we didn't know what to do, so we went on the train, and then we walked for 25 kilometers to the next thing. But on the way, all of a sudden my aunt went like this. And here we saw there was this thing built all out of twigs with leaves and everything. And we heard men's voices, you know, and all of a sudden somebody yells, "Halt!" And we stopped, and we knew that people who were caught crossing the border were sent either to the Ural salt mines or to Siberia or killed outright. So we're all standing there crying. But the oldest sister of my mother had her head together. She reached into her rucksack and she sneaked around into that grass thing or whatever the thing was and put a bottle of schnapps there. And then they showed us, they said, you know, if anybody finds out we did this, they're going to kill us. They were German border police, and they showed us if we go in this brook and go real low, on that side was the Russian side, on that side was the English side. So we're down there, and my aunt was, even though it was warm, she was pretty corpulent. She said, "Oh, I can't anymore." And I would grab her backside. Come on! But when we were on the other side, we all laid down and cried. But then we still had to walk quite a bit to get to the next railroad station, because we had to hurry, because we didn't have their new money yet. You know, we still had the East money. So we made it, and then we crossed the Lüneburger Heide, and we got to Westphalia, which is my hometown, Wanne Eickel, which is in the Ruhr Valley, where also the bombing was horrendous. And I stayed with my aunt, and my uncle had found a house that had been hit with an incendiary, so it was all burned out, but the bottom floor and the second floor had been restored, and the roof was on it. But there was like a mansard, and it was just raw wood, you know. And my uncle got that. And in the backyard there was like a box of wood, about this high, maybe a yard and a half square. And he would pour cement in there and water in there. And I got this hoe with a hole in it, and I had to mix it all up, you know. And then I had to shovel it in a bucket. And then I had to walk over underneath the third floor window, and there was a chain, a pulley and a chain, and I had to pull these buckets up to the third floor. That's why I have Mookie Mookie. And when the thing was finished, my parents finally came over. And they knew I missed my piano, so my mother had exchanged in the trademark in Leipzig. She had exchanged a fur coat for an accordion. So I taught myself how to play accordion. Well, then we were in the West, but my father didn't seem to be able to find work there. So he applied for a job in the American zone in Nuremberg. And he went there, and I had an aunt who lived in Bamberg, and that was in the American zone, so I figured, well, maybe they have chocolate. So I said, I'm going with Fanny. And I went with him, and I stayed with my aunt, who also knew an American. She had rented a room to a woman who was going with an American, and I did get the candy. But that was only 1 month, and then the place where my father started to work supplied us with an apartment, and my mother came, and everything was, you know, pretty much normal. I finished the 8th grade, And incidentally, by the time I came to the West, because I have to give the Russians credit of their insistence that our curriculum would be so enlarged and that they were very keen on our education, I was way ahead of everybody. And so I went through 8th grade, and we made a little band. Some boys played guitar, and one had a little drum thing, a snare drum. And I played the accordion, and we played da 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 on the weekends, because we were, after I finished 8th grade, I applied for an apprenticeship, a commercial apprenticeship, and for 3 years I went to work from 8 o'clock until 5 at night, Monday through Friday, and Saturday from 8 till 1.
At age 13?
14, yeah. And then we had Saturday afternoon and Sunday off, and my girlfriend and I would take bike tours through the Franconian Swiss. We slept in the farmer's barn, you know. We had a good time. And, well, anyway, then my parents moved to the city, and I didn't know anybody there, except we had been friends with a family of Americans. He was a football player. The wife was English, and he was an American, and they had 2 little boys and a boxer dog. And I was always anxious to practice my English, so I practiced that. And through her, I met Ken, who later became my husband. So after I graduated from my apprenticeship, I was 17, and I got married and came over here in 1952. And that's it. Is there anything I can tell you?
What's the name of the town that you lived in, Bad what?
Bad Dürrenberg,
Duenberg?
yes.
With an R, right?
What was the
Durban.
D, umlaut, R-E-N-B-E-R-G,
Yeah.
And what was the name of the chemical company?
Leuna. It's right here,
How do you spell it?
Leunawerke.
How do you spell
Pardon?
it? How do you spell it?
L-E-U-N-A.
Thank you.
Yeah. It was within sight. You could. This was Dürrenberg, and this was the Leunawerke. That's why we got so many bombs. Yes.
What about your parents? I mean, you left when you were 17. Did you go back? Did they come? What happened?
I didn't see them for 10 years. And then things were not going so well because my husband had died in a car accident, and I had a little girl, and they thought I was coming back, and I went back, but I couldn't get used to it anymore because all the years I'd been here, I'd been working, and you know, things were totally, my adult life I'd lived here, you know, and so I came back, and then after that my parents saved their money, and they bought a piece of land in the Bavarian Alps, and they had a bed and breakfast built for them.
Nice.
And so I went back, and my mother was working so hard because she didn't have a washing machine, she didn't have a dryer, and she had all these guests coming, you know, some only staying for a week, and she's boiling the sheets and all, and I said, why are you doing all this, you know? And she said, for you, I'm an only child. And I did my best to talk them out of it, and they sold it, and they bought a row house in Munich and a new car, and they went traveling every year after that, and they came here every other year because I had 6 children, and I couldn't be going all the time, you know. So that was it.
How did you get to State College?
Oh, one of my daughters, what really started it was I used to run a credit union. And I won a scholarship to the National Credit Union Institute here at State College. And I came here, and I was here for like 2-3 weeks in the summertime. And I thought this area is really pretty and everything, and I was very impressed. And so when one of my daughters wanted to apply to college, I said, check that out, that's really neat there, you know. So anyway, she came here, and she's been here now for 20 years. She's married, and I think Sarah knows her. And she has a little boy, she's married, and I had a severe stroke about 11 years ago, and so I couldn't work anymore, and I had to sell my house. So I lived in a place something like this, only it was just 2 stories, but in an area that was pretty dangerous. You know, it was near the Philadelphia airport and all this.
That's bad.
Yeah.
Recommend that.
I was content there, you know, but my daughter said, you know, we've been thinking, how do you feel about coming to State College? And I said, well, I'm adaptable. So I hadn't even seen the apartment or anything. I gave most of my stuff away and came here with a U-Haul truck.
That works.
And I've been happy ever since.
What was your apprenticeship in that you served?
Commercial apprenticeship. That was a thing that I think was a very good thing, because I actually wanted to become an interpreter, but my father said, you know, even if you are an interpreter, you have to have office skills. And he didn't believe in girls going to college. He thought, you know, they only get married anyway, which I did. But in any case, we learned in 2 afternoons a week, we had to go to school where we learned in theory what we had to work with in practice at the office. And at every quarter, our boss and our professor and our parents had to sign the report cards to make sure we were doing exactly what we were being taught. And that involved all accounting and stenography and typing and German business law and all that kind of stuff. But when I came here, I could not translate the German steno into the English language, so I went right for the numbers. So I've been a bookkeeper, accountant most of my life, but I also earned my certificate as a real estate associate, and at one time when one of my kids was really little, I also was an electronic welder for Raytheon. Yeah.
For what company?
Raytheon.
I retired from Raytheon.
Yeah, this was in
Right
Waltham.
here.
Yeah,
Massachusetts, were you in the headquarters?
Yeah, that was in Massachusetts, and we had to weld these filaments for transistors for U-boats. So that was it. Any other questions?
Where did you live in Massachusetts?
I lived in Malden.
Walden?
Yes, and at first I worked. I had to take the bus to Everett, and then from Everett take the MTA into town, because then I was working for Mass General Hospital. I was first a biller, and then I was in charge of the emergency ward accounts. So, yes?
Tell us a little more about your
About me?
About your adventures in stealing or helping your family to get food.
Oh,
You said you stole from the
Well-
train. Did you have any near times when you almost got caught when you were?
yes, my mother got caught by the field police. See, the Saxony is totally flat. And they had all these fields and everything, and there were strawberry fields and everything. And one time, the women the 4 women in our building decided, oh, they wanted strawberries so bad, you know. So they went out there and they got caught by the field police.
What happened then?
Well, they just chased them away, you know.
Oh.
And the same thing was one of my girlfriends had, she had found out after a rain there was an apple orchard quite away from where we lived. And she said, they won't mind if we pick up the apples that have fallen down after a storm, you know. So we walked and walked and walked, and we had these bags, and we filled them with apples from the ground. We didn't pick any. Honest to God, we didn't. And here the field police came, and they took us in the police station and took our apples away.
And you were saying, I didn't take any from the tree, right? That's
No,
what
we
you're
didn't,
telling
no.
me.
They wouldn't believe you.
No.
Were the field police Russians or Germans?
Pardon?
Were the field police Russian?
German,
They were German, but
Yeah.
under the control of the Russian
yes.
occupiers.
Everything was under, and as I told you about when we stole off the trains, coal and fertilizer and stuff, they got wise, and after just a few times they started arming the trains with guards, with carabines. And people still dared, but then they had German shepherds, and they chased us everywhere, you know. And I was already over here, and I was married, but they had told us that if a German shepherd comes right after you, all you have to do is shove your fist in their throat, and then they can't bite. And I would wake up screaming just before I get my fist in
Yeah, I would think so.
for a long time.
I heard that one.
Who were the German police that you referred to? I mean, were they people that had fought in the war, or?
No, those were just police
After the
like
war.
here, you know.
Okay, just local policemen.
Yeah,
So they really hadn't been involved in the war effort?
those, no.
Specifically?
This is after the war.
During that time when they were constantly bombing, I think you said it was 2 or 3 weeks, something like that, was their goal to hit that factory?
That's what their goal was.
Did they?
The whole time, the whole war.
No, did they hit the factory?
I don't know.
Oh,
They hit us plenty of times.
yeah. Oh, my goodness.
Visibility was poor.
There was an article, I think it was in the New York Times, on a book review on Sunday, which basically made the case that the Germans didn't get, an average German family refused to get involved when people rose up, when the war was basically over and the troops were coming in from the various countries, that when somebody would rise up against the Nazis and so on, the average German person didn't get involved.
Well, they tried not to, but they were forced to.
Well, this said that basically they didn't, and then even if an individual, recognized.
Well, you
that-
know, so much has been written that didn't actually happen.
Yeah, sure.
That's why I really, one of the reasons I decided to do this presentation is because, first of all, to let people know that war is not a big thing, it affects each and every person. My life is just one of millions, and the suffering is incredible. And I can understand the Second World War was necessary. Hitler had to be stopped. But these later wars here, on the rumors that there are weapons of mass destruction and all this kind of stuff, it doesn't make sense to me, first of all, to spend all this money to produce these weapons and things, then go in there and bomb and destroy the heck out of them, and then spend more money building it back up again. Now that doesn't make sense to me. You know, but I guess that's going to be forever. But I was just hoping that one day we'll all wake up and say, stop, this is enough. You know? And the other reason I decided to do this is I also was a member of the League of Women Voters. And it, I think, is a shame that such a large percentage of American citizens don't take the time to educate themselves about their candidates and to vote. That's another one, and another one is the freedom of the press. If you don't have that, you can have another Hitler in a minute. Education is really the key. Yes?
How did your family keep in touch during, I mean, you left with your aunt and I think you said a cousin and got across.
You didn't.
You didn't?
Hmm.
But they came then to
They
the
came
same place?
With the accordion.
What?
With an accordion.
How did they know where to find you?
34 bases.
How did they, he said, how did they know where to find you?
Oh, they knew I was in my hometown, in Van Eyck, which is in the Ruhr Valley. It's not far from, you might have heard, Essen, which is where the Kruppbergs were, and that's why there we were bombed all over Kingdom Come too. So,
When you say that was your hometown, you mean before the war, or
Yes.
in the early part of the war?
I
that
was
your
born
hometown?
there. I was born there,
Oh, okay.
and
And
when
then-
I was 4 years old, all the children were sent to the country because that part was bombed so severely.
Yeah.
And I was in the country, and I contracted scarlet fever. So they had to bring me back there, and I was in the hospital in isolation on the 3rd floor, and they didn't have a bunker for anybody with a contagious disease. So we were there while all the bombs were falling. We thought the world was coming to an end.
Yeah, well, that was when you were 4. Then how did you get to Saxony when you were, what,
Well,
about 10?
through my father's work. From Eichel we went to Silesia, which is now Poland,
Right,
to a place called Waldenburg
okay.
and Hirschberg. Then we went back to Van Eyck, and then we went to Saxony,
Okay,
to Bad Dürrenberg.
because he was in the service.
Right,
Okay. And when you came
completely
to
from the
United
west to the east. Pardon?
Well, is Massachusetts the first place you came to when you?
Yeah, that's where I got
1952?
off the plane.
And then, but-
Logan Airport.
but you came-
And the thing was, you know, my husband had told me how beautiful America is and everything. And when you take a ride from Logan Airport to another place, all you see is junkyards.
But your husband died later in an automobile accident, you
Yes.
say? How much later? After
10 years, after 10 years.
1962.
1962, yes.
Now, were you still in Massachusetts at that time?
No, he had brought us to
Or
Philadelphia.
Philadelphia?
Yeah, I was in Philadelphia, and then I did go back, but I couldn't get used to it anymore. I was so used to being here,
Right.
working and being independent and all this, so I
Did you
can't.
marry again then, or not?
I got married again, and I was married for 30 years, had 5 more kids,
Okay.
and then I ran away from home. End of story.
Well, they'll never find you here.
I have a question, and I don't mean to be offensive at all. Did the German people, like you, were you aware of when Hitler committed suicide and all that was going on? No, they didn't tell you. You didn't know any of it.
We knew he was hiding out in the bunker
Yeah,
with Eva Braun,
yeah,
but that's as far as it goes.
okay. And that was in Berlin, right?
Yeah.
It was in Berlin.
So you didn't know the war was over until the Americans arrived?
Yeah. For us, that was the end of it, you know.
But it wasn't over at that point.
No, not for
Then the
everybody.
Russians came.
No, the Russians came in.
Yes?
And it's very interesting. I lived in Germany for 10 years.
Oh, you
And,
were?
Yeah, and I lived in Kronberg, which is about 20 minutes outside of Frankfurt.
Oh, okay.
And but it was always interesting to me that you don't see any evidence of the war in Germany. I mean, they
I know.
basically ignore it. We
When
were
I
driving-
went back for my father's and mother's funeral,
Yeah.
I would walk down the street and I said, so this is what it looks like in peacetime, you know. There were gardens with flowers and flowers coming out the window cases and everything, you know. And I just remember in Eichel, they had built a bunker that would, if it got hit full force, it would sway underground. And many people were killed to death because it was hit and they got stabbed to death because, yes.
We were driving down the Mosel River one day. I saw a sign
Beautiful
for a
place.
cemetery.
Oh, you're right.
And it was the only evidence of the cemetery I'd seen, a German cemetery, war cemetery. What's the word for cemetery? I can't think. Krieg is war, but what's the word for cemetery?
I don't know
I don't
about that.
remember. Okay, well, I saw the sign and knew it was a cemetery. So we parked the car and we got out and walked, and there was one other sign, and then we walked up this road past a little stuba, and we still couldn't find it. My wife said, "Oh, let's give up. We can't find it." Well, we were at a split of the river where another river comes off the Mosel. I can't remember. And I said, "Well, I'm going to walk down in that direction." So I walked about 500 yards. All of a sudden, I came on top. I found the cemetery. Everybody in the cemetery was basically ages 14 to 17, killed in the last days of the war. German soldiers,
Yeah.
that had been
My
conscripted to the
cousin
youth corps.
was pulled into the service at 13,
Was it?
to the end of the war. Yeah, and they put a gun in his hand, and my father, who had a heart problem, got pulled in at the end of the war, like maybe 2 years before the war was over, and he ended up as an American prisoner of
Really?
war.
Seeing this was one of the most moving things that I've ever experienced. I mean, I ran down and got my
I've
wife,
never seen
came
that.
back and stood there, and it was
Yeah.
so sad to see all these young men that had been killed right in the final days of the war.
Yeah. I mean, that's why I know they've been going on forever, and I just hope someday we're going to learn from our mistakes.
As long as there are Hitlers, there are gonna be wars.
Yeah, as long as there's greed.
Great, yeah.
But it takes
power.
It
It
takes
takes
power.
somebody,
It
yeah,
takes
Yeah.
that absolute power that corrupts,
power,
absolutely.
it does. It's the truth. Yes.
I think you were incredibly brave, and I just appreciate you giving this talk. I think you leaving your home and facing the guards and everything you did, I think you were incredibly brave, and something I've only read about. I don't know that I would be that brave.
Well, if you had to be,
Maybe.
I thank you for that, but it was a very traumatic
I'll bet.
thing, and I mean, we didn't have counselors when things happened, we're all kind of damaged in a way. My nightmares were proof of that.
But to be able to stand here and tell us about it, that's bravery too.
Well, I wanted to do it because now that I've told you about it, I can forget about all that.
But tell us a little more about what you carried with you when you made your escape. What, I mean,
Nothing but what we could carry.
you had some food with you,
No food.
and how many days, how long did it take you to make that?
It only took us, it took us a half day, no, it took us 1 day to walk the 25 kilometers. And then we were so exhausted, we laid down on the railroad, not the tracks, but on the, whatever that's called.
Cars.
And then we were on the train and we didn't have any food then. It took about 2 days to get back to Westphalia.
And your parents had an easier time getting out because they had a place to go?
They had a place to stay, you know, we had fixed it. Unfortunately, they only needed it for 2 months before they moved out.
Okay.
But that was hard work. I still have the muscles.
Yeah.
Do you find this area of Pennsylvania similar to the central part of Germany?
Yes, I do. Yes. I am so happy that my daughter invited me to come up here. I've been more at peace here, and I've had some health problems, some severe health problems, but I've overcome them too, and I'm happier than I've ever been.
Maslow's hierarchy of need, you know, the triangle that states before you can self-actualize, you have to feel safe and you have food. Have you ever heard of Maslow's hierarchy of need? What's the psychology thing? He's a psychologist.
Abraham
It's a triangle, and at the top is where we reach self-actualization. At the very bottom, though, you can't go up to the top until you get over, until you're safe and you're fed and your basic needs are met.
Yeah.
How old were you, do you think, before you felt that was secure enough for you to move forward?
I tell you something, I haven't felt secure until I moved here.
Wow.
I've not felt really safe anywhere.
Okay, thank you.
But here I feel safe and happy, and hopefully I'll get skinny.
Marlies, is there anybody still in Germany that you have contact with?
Yes,
that you have-
I have 4 cousins. I went back, one of my daughters is an airline attendant. And so I had the opportunity to go back about just before I moved here. And we all had a get together, they're all older now, and we all got together and we still, you know, on birthdays, we call each other and everything. Yeah.
And where are they living?
I have 2 cousins in Munich, one in Essen and one in Wattenscheid.
Wattenscheid?
That's near Bochum.
Okay.
Now you know exactly where I am.
You're Bochum, living through there.
Also, the picture at the bottom there next, I'm assuming that's you.
Yes,
Okay.
and that's the sweater that we made out of the glass
Right.
wool.
Now, the one next to it, is that your
I
grandson?
didn't even tell you about
Okay,
that.
because I found that pretty interesting in
Yes.
a way.
My youngest son was in Iraq several times, and he kept in touch with me by email. And he sent me this picture, and I saved it because I thought it was like a circle coming around, you know, because an American gave me chocolate, my first chocolate, and now my son is giving it to the Iraqi kids.
Oh,
Yeah, there's a picture of 2 Iraqi kids there with
Yeah.
him in the picture.
Yes.
Is there anything you should tell us about the rest of those pictures, so when we come up, we know what we're looking at?
Well, most of it is written. This part of the map is what was occupied by the Russians. And this is the Tehran conference with Stalin, Roosevelt, and Churchill. And this is the Yalta summit with Churchill, Roosevelt, and Stalin. And this is about the siege of Stalingrad. And this is about the Leunawerke. And I actually didn't know how much they dumped on us, but I put that up on the computer. So I said, so that's what it was. And let's see, this is when the soldiers came home, and what happened was, at the end of the war, next to our settlement, there were fields, you know, and the soldiers came struggling, you know, one by one. And here, two of my cousins, one came first, then another one, and my mother took them in, you know, and they had been in the war, and then they were lying, you know, in Germany, they don't have screens. They were lying in the window, you know, looking out the window. And they said, "Oh, there's Uncle Erich." That was my father. And by the time I got to the top of the steps, my mother and father were sitting, hugging and kissing on the bottom of the steps. Yeah. But then what happened when they heard that the Russians were coming, they had in the meantime met two girls that they liked. They were handsome young men. And they had met two girls, and they borrowed their bicycles and took off for the West. They didn't want to be under the Russians.
You mentioned, you alluded to the 10% of the mark, the reduction.
Yes.
And talk a little bit about what happened to people's wealth and so on. with
Well,
that,
all their savings were only worth 10%.
of what they were.
Yeah.
Yes,
That was when?
That was 1948.
I don't understand, I mean, the Russians control one part, English, British.
No,
control
this
the-
was in the West.
Oh, in the West you're talking about?
Yeah.
This is the Deutschmark, not the Reichsmark, right?
But you're saying
That
in
was
the
the
West they
Deutsch.
took the
This is
currency and
Deutschmark
devalued
now.
it.
Now they have the euro.
Of course, yeah.
Yeah.
But you're saying they devalued it in the West after the war,
Right.
10%, that's interesting.
Yeah.
We were on a tour of Russian River cruise just, you know, a couple years ago.
Right.
And the Ollie sponsored trip. And the young man who was our host, who guided us, they did, you know, a wonderful job. But he said his family's wealth, this is why this interested me. I mean, they had wealth, and then they had $300. That was it. What they had was.
So that was
to
10%.
$300.
I can remember pictures in Life magazine, I think, where it showed them shoveling marks to a grocery store where they went to buy food or something.
Oh,
I mean, this was.
they had to take
Yeah.
like this to pay for.
That was probably the Reichsmark.
I forget. They have Deutschmark, Reichsmark. I don't remember. I'm a little older now, you know.
Just a little.
Oh, no, come on. I don't like that laughter.
I was being nice, I wasn't being sarcastic.
I know that.
I was just gonna say that after the Cold War ended, then they equalized the mark though, and then everybody in the eastern, sector, their marks were worth as much as everybody in the western sector.
Right.
Which was, in retrospect, in my opinion, a big mistake to do that, because
Well,
they
there
then,
was,
instead
there
of
was a
buying
lot of
East German.
controversy. I was already over here when that happened.
Right,
The Russian side had been so deteriorated,
right.
and the rivers had all been smudged, what do you say? Eroded, not polluted.
Right.
And so there was like an exodus to the west,
Right.
and that was a burden to the west. And they thought, why should we suffer now because of them, you know?
Well, that's what happened to East Germans. They didn't want to buy anything in East Germany because the stuff was all garbage, and their money is all of a sudden valued, so they bought everything in West Germany, and so that didn't help the recovery of the eastern part of Germany, unfortunately.
Yeah. I haven't been back since we escaped. But I understand the place is a disaster now.
Your town, you mean?
Pardon?
Your town, you mean, or what?
Your
What's
town?
a disaster?
What's a disaster?
You have to stop?
The
East
East Germany.
Oh, East Germany.
The ones occupied by the Russians.
On the whole East
Because
nice.
they took everything that was not, even what was nailed down, because they took the railroad tracks. While in the British zone, they didn't take anything, but we didn't have much left anyway. But in the American zone, it was like, I don't know how they, the land of milk and honey, you know, people came, I had my first banana. I mean, my mother had false fruit, you know, like wax fruit on the dining room table, bananas and oranges and everything. I'd never seen it, but I was so hungry, it had all my teeth marks in it.
Some parts of it are pretty nice today, though. You talked about Leipzig. I mean, Leipzig is a very thriving city.
It's rebuilt.
Beautiful
Is
city.
it?
Yeah.
Yeah, lots of industrial.
That's
there.
great. How about Dresden? Have you been to Dresden?
Yes, Dresden's
Yeah.
gorgeous. Oh, yeah. Yep.
Yeah, it's
That
all
was,
rebuilt.
that was horrible
Dresden's
what happened
really
there.
nice. Yeah, Dresden's beautiful.
Bomber Harris destroyed the
Yeah.
place. The Brit general. His
Oh,
nickname was Bomber Harris.
oh.
They bombed Dresden almost out of existence.
That was a real tragedy.
Almost like the Munich too, when they dumped all the bombs there.
When you,
I mean, people were running, burning, the asphalt was burning. And they were all refugees from the east. There weren't any soldiers or anybody there.
Prisoners of war.
It was all women and children. But it's over, and we're here, and hopefully we can prevent that from happening to anyone else. I'm hope against hope.
Thank you.
I always felt
we'll see you again.
Germany, that it reminded me so much of Pennsylvania. The only difference was, in Pennsylvania, we didn't have any red cloud roofs. Yes. And I laughed at some point when you said something about you had to have a home, or you had to have a place to live. And all I could think of was, now I can't say it, and I thought I'd never forget that word. David House Canumnico. That's not right. But it's Can you remember what that was? It was one of the words that I remember in German. Anyway, thank you.
Now, this is that